Oxygen. Oxygen is critical for life. It is the oxygen we breathe. It is the oxygen that fuels our growth, our movements. Now, for water scientists, for decades we've measured oxygen using concentration. Okay, that's been, in my mind, that was the true measure of oxygen. There's different ways you can measure oxygen. You can also measure oxygen as a partial pressure of, think of the weight of the oxygen pushing down in the atmosphere. You can also look at the percent saturation, how much oxygen is there as a proportion of what could be if it was an equilibrium in the water. So, dating back to the mid-80s, the US EPA released guidelines for the United States, but this was widely adopted and adapted. That guideline was based on oxygen concentration, and I suspect a lot of what I understood to be the true measure of oxygen was based on, it probably originated from that guideline. Okay, it said concentration was a better measurement because it gave more consistent response in lab tests. Okay, so you didn't have to muck about with temperature. Temperature is really important, but by using concentration, which incorporates temperature, they could simplify the guidelines, which was good logic. But now that we've had some more recent research done, that's really crystallized for me that we've been using the wrong measurement in a lot of cases, not all cases. Oxygen concentration remains valid for some situations, like general comparisons. But there was an article by Wilco Verberk, which really tried to reevaluate this question of what is the true measurement. And the reason he did that was not to satisfy my personal like for oxygen concentration. No, it was more water scientists conventionally use concentration. Okay, when they go out and measure oxygen and apply that in various settings, discharge consents, and toxicity studies, etc. But there are a whole other disciplines in science that do not use concentration, reject the use of concentration as not appropriate, not valid. Physiologists, including fish physiologists, conventionally use the partial pressure of oxygen as the true measure that dictates how much oxygen is available to react and interact with organisms. Likewise, medical researchers use partial pressure. Partial pressure in terms of what oxygen is available. Once the oxygen's in the body, they use other measures like percent of hemoglobin sites that are bound with oxygen, things like that. But partial pressure being the prevailing true measure. So Wilco did some excellent research, in my opinion, looking at partial pressure, looking at concentration, and he used first principles, physical first principles to, like Henry's law, to really tackle this and try and work out, well, what is the correct measure, what is measuring availability of oxygen to aquatic life, to other forms of life. And the reason I came to this article was because going back a step, we were looking at oxygen standards and oxygen measurement methods and streams, and we were having trouble calibrating our instruments in a supersaturated situation. And I thought, well, it's easy. You just vary the temperature, and you achieve a wide range of concentrations which would be supersaturated at other temperatures. Now, David Brown from Horizons Regional Council, he politely pointed out, well, actually, that doesn't achieve a supersaturated calibration because the instrument's not measuring concentration, it's measuring saturation. Now, I thought, how could this be true? Why would the instruments be measuring saturation when concentration is the true measurement? That's what I've known, that's what I've worked with. And the more I looked into it, the more I realised, A, he was right, that instruments certainly do measure something that's much more like saturation, and B, that it's not just the instruments that are doing something weird or funny, that galvanic cells respond differently to fish. No. The fish also experience oxygen as something more like saturation, more like partial pressure. And much like this new measure of oxygen available that Wilco Verberk developed from first principles. So, and this, it was really staring us in the face. We spent all this time making our instruments spit out a different reading that was adjusted for temperature, even though that's not what the sensors weren't affected by temperature, the sensors weren't affected by salinity, and yet we've forced an adjustment to the output to align with our preconception, or my preconception, that concentration was in fact the true measure. Splitting, and really what this comes back to is the difference between how much oxygen is available, how much oxygen is reaching the gills of the fish or the invertebrates, and how much oxygen the fish or bug needs. So there's oxygen supply and there's oxygen demand. Oxygen demand, now that's where temperature becomes really important. Most freshwater inhabitants are cold-blooded. Okay, so when you're cold-blooded, when the temperature goes up, you become more active, you need more oxygen. So, yes, temperature is important on the demand side. On the supply side, the temperature, rather than decreasing oxygen availability, as would be indicated from measuring concentration, what actually happens is the oxygen is equally available at higher temperatures and actually slightly more available at higher temperatures. And what happens, yes, you have less oxygen atoms in the water at a higher temperature, but they're moving faster. That's the simplification of Wilco's research, I think, if I've understood it correctly, is they're basically moving faster, and that more than compensates for the fact that there's less atoms in the water. And also, when you add salt, as in the ocean, you reduce the concentration, but you don't reduce the availability. The atoms are still moving quickly, partly governed by the pressure from the atmosphere. Okay, so I hope that helps.